Back in December, Jagex promised to add more large creatures that are weak to slash, with the sole aim of making the scythe more useful, since it is after all the rarest piece of equipment from the Theatre of Blood, one of the end level raids in old school RuneScape. That one statement alone pretty much led to one of the biggest price hikes the game has ever seen. 350 million GP up to 1.37 billion in just 18 months. But was it all just one big elaborate ruse? We did have a buff in January of plus 15 to accuracy, and whilst that is nice, the scythe is notoriously good against low defense creatures anyway, where accuracy is, well, practically pointless, resulting in the 0.2% damage increase that they quoted at most bosses rather than the 7% you can get at Bandos. It also doesn't factor in items like the Dragon Warhammer or the Elder Maul that lowers a creature's defense, again making accuracy far less important. It also now has its first real competition that it's had for a while. With the release of the Tormented Demons came the Emberlight, a weapon that has 70% extra damage and accuracy against demonic creatures, 3 of which the scythe used to be best in slot for, and 1 it was second best in slot for. So it's time to put these two head to head, to see if we're actually paying 1 billion GP more for what is essentially now an inferior weapon. I want to start out at the Duke because in theory this one is the one the scythe should really be winning at. That's because this boss has a 30% passive resistance to any Demon Bane weaponry, meaning you're only getting 70% of the effect that you normally get from the Emberlight. Whilst I would be surprised if the scythe lost this, if it does, it pretty much guarantees that the scythe will lose against every single one of these bosses. So it's going to be interesting to see if it is ahead and by how much. For every boss that I'm going to test, I'm going to use the exact same setup, apart from having an Avernic with the Emberlight, since it's a one-handed weapon. The method I use will also be the same, and so will my inventory. I'm also not going to be using special attacks, because whilst the Emberlight has a very useful special attack, and the Scythe doesn't have any, you could simply bring an Emberlight along with a Scythe just for its special attack if you wanted to, or any other weapon just for its spec. Plus, with RNG, if you hit a few more times using a defense reducing special attack, more than when I test the next weapon, it could really impact the results, and I just want them to be as fair as possible. I've been killing the Duke, and the plan was initially that I was going to do 20 kills using both weapons, but it is so noticeable how much better the Scythe is here when I tested it before, so I think I'm just going to stop at 10 with the Emberlight. I already did the 20 kills with the Scythe because that's what I was going to do, so I'll split the Scythe's results into 2 just so you can see it wasn't a one-off. The Scythe absolutely destroyed it. The first run took me 24 minutes and 45 seconds with the Scythe, and the second run took me 25 minutes and 20 seconds. Compare that to the Emberlight, which took 27 minutes, and you may think, well, that's not too bad for a weapon that's a fraction of the cost. But half of this fight is the preparation, and it takes the same time no matter what weapon you use. So let's be generous and only deduct 10 minutes for the prep from each time, and even doing that, the Emberlight is still down on DPS by over 10%, and realistically, probably closer to 15. But in fairness, the Duke is only 70% weak to Demon Bane weapons, so what about the other bosses that are 100% weak to it? Cerberus is probably the hardest one to predict because it's all a little bit messy. Even though this boss is weak to Crush, and the Scythe is best on Slash, it does also have a Crush attack style, albeit that the accuracy bonus on Crush is the equivalent of a Bronze Warhammer, but a very expensive one at that. Even still, the boss's overall defense is so low, the Scythe on Crush has been the best weapon here, but is it still? The Emberlight doesn't have it all its own way either, because it doesn't have a Crush attack. It does though have a stab attack, and Cerberus' stab defense is only marginally higher than its Crush. And whilst that is a disadvantage, the Emberlight pulls that back because on stab it is far more accurate than the Scythe is on crush. So yeah, that is far more confusing than it probably needs to be. Essentially, the Scythe was best in slot, and there's only one way to find out if that's still the case. Now, when I was testing this, it ended up being so close, I had no idea which was the better one at the time. It needed multiple runs to do what ended up being a 28 kill trip on each weapon, but because I had to bank a few times, I've also had to remove that part and then edit into one clip before I could see which one was the fastest. Both of these weapons completed 28 kills, finishing in a time of 32 minutes, but the Scythe took an additional 25 seconds on top of that, and the Emberlight another 55 seconds, meaning the Scythe won. Well, you know I said it was messy comparing these two weapons against this boss and testing it was going to clear it up? Yeah, that didn't happen. You see, when using the Scythe I banged 3 times and I only banged twice using the Emberlight. Now, partly that is because I hadn't done Cerberus in a while, so I was slightly rusty, plus my prayer to food ratios was a little bit off in my inventory, and it got better as I'd done a few more trips. However, I definitely took less damage in general due to the Avernix's defensive melee stat. When you add in things like supply drops that you can get and the Amulet of Blood Fury heals, it can make a big difference as to how long you can stay here. Simply banking one less time every 4 or 5 trips would probably put those two weapons on a par, and unlike the Scythe, the Emberlight doesn't need charging. So the Scythe is best in slot, but it's so close even the wiki doesn't pick a side, and I'm sure some people will prefer the Emberlight here over the Scythe. So what about a more straightforward boss? The Scythe on Slash and a boss 100% weak to the Emberlight, a completely fair fight. But first, to test this one, I was going to need an Abyssal Demon Slayer task.
Nope.
That took so long. I mean, I think I've got about 1300 Slayer points now, which is not all bad because there is a big update next week with a new Slayer boss. Anyway, we can now test the Abyssal Sire, which does have decent defensive stats, 250 overall defense and plus 60 to slash, but I also wanted to add in a third weapon into the mix for this one, because plenty of players think that the Fang is the best in slot weapon here, purely due to its accuracy. Now, there is a first phase to this boss, so I'll be editing out that completely and starting every kill on the first hit on the boss in phase 2, and cutting it at the end of every kill just as the loot drops. After I piece all of this together, we will know definitively which is the best melee weapon at this boss, and I've got a feeling that these will be extremely close. So after 20 kills, even though the Fang did finish in first place with a time of 19 minutes and 34 seconds, right behind it was the Emberlight, just 14 seconds slower. But remember, I wasn't using any special attack weapon in order to keep the results as accurate as possible. So as soon as we introduce a defense lowering special attack, the Fang hardly benefits from it at all, simply because it's already an incredibly accurate weapon due to its 2 chances to hit mechanism. The Emberlight, however, would greatly benefit and without doubt bridge that gap and then some, becoming the best in slot weapon for this boss. But what about the Scythe? Well, it might surprise some people to learn that it was slower than the Fang by almost a minute. And weirdly, it actually felt like it hit the best of the time when I was testing these. And the reason it falls behind the others is not because of its accuracy, but it's more because it sometimes attacks the minions instead of the boss. To showcase that point, whilst every Fang or Emberlight kill was consistently between 50 seconds and about a minute and 5 seconds, this one Scythe kill took me just 37 seconds, which got me the achievement They Grow Up Fast without even trying. The Scythe for now has dropped down the order at this boss behind the Emberlight as well as the Fang, but I think there's a strategy somewhere, if anyone can find it, where you don't hit the minions by positioning yourself in a different way. In which case, if that is possible, my gut feeling is that the Scythe would then just about edge it and be the best at this boss. The final boss I wanted to test was Skotizo, but I will be using the Emberlight on the altars for both weapons as it's always guaranteed to max hit and one-shot them. Now, to do this boss, you need a Dark Totem, and you get pieces of it from the Catacombs of Korand, which you put together, and despite doing over 30 Slayer tasks, pretty much all here deliberately to get some of these, plus another couple of thousand kills barraging Dust Devils, oh, and about 8 hours AFKing Abyssal Demons, I managed to get just 4 of these. I did manage to get a whip though. Well, actually 3 in the end. I was here for that long. But thankfully, 2 kills with each weapon here was more than enough to see which was actually the best. For the first half of this fight, it's really close between the 2 weapons, but then the Emberlight gets a massive advantage. Rather than running around the room destroying every altar when they start to spawn, with high stats you can simply brute force the boss a little bit by positioning yourself between 2 altars and only destroying those 2. Now every altar that's up does reduce your damage by 15% if you're using an Emberlight or 25% with a scythe, but equally, running around the room wastes a lot of time too. With decent gear and stats, the boss is normally below half health before any altars spawn at all, and pretty low health by the time you kinda get at least 3. At that point, you would think the last 10 to 25% of health wouldn't be much different at all, with a scythe getting a 50% damage reduction against an Emberlight that gets a 30% damage reduction, but as you can see, the difference was incredible. What happens is not only are you doing less damage, but that also gives more time for the altars to spawn again, which ends up being a double blow. That last part of the fight really separates the 2 weapons, and without doubt the Emberlight is now the best in slot here. So with all that new information, is the scythe worth 1.37 billion GP? Well, I think we all know we're being merged slightly because Jagex announced to the world that they intend to find more uses for the scythe. That aside, is it more useful now? We do have the Colosseum where the scythe is best in slot against many creatures including the boss, and although the buff it got in January was small, it was still a buff. Plus, do we even care that it's not best in slot at Skotizo, a boss you only kill a few times a year, or that it's 3rd best in slot against the Abyssal sire instead of 2nd? Whilst I started out wanting to test these to see if the Emberlight is having a negative impact on the scythe, it seems that the opposite is actually true. By Jagex wanting the scythe to be more in demand, it feels like they've had to hold back on the Emberlight stats deliberately not to step on its toes. But the Emberlight, similar to Dragonbane weapons, only has one job. It should at least be the best at it in my opinion. Instead, we have a new Arclight that is 67 million GP, that's best in slot against some demonic slayer creatures like lesser demons, greater demons, black demons and so on, a boss you hardly ever fight, and another one in the Abyssal side that you only really kill for the achievement or the pet. Speaking of which, when testing all these bosses, I managed to get another one of those things that follows you around all day, even though I've already got one at home.
Dad.